Kind of seems like I've been doing a series of videos recently that deal with kind of unusual silver. And really, honestly, that's kind of what my stack is made up of now. I started back in the day picking up the odds and ends that most of us seem to do, 1 ounce silver bars, 90% silver. But as time progressed, I think I focused more on pieces that were unusual and interesting. And this is definitely a video about some very unusual and interesting silver. These are mega monster metals made out of 999 silver way back in the early 60s. And that's what this video is going to be about. If you are new to the channel, my name is Dub C, and I want to welcome you to the channel. Thank you for being here with me. Hopefully, you will like and subscribe to the channel. Love to have you be part of this community. If you are one of my returning subscribers, thank you guys, as always, for being with me on this journey. I think you're going to like this. These are kind of weird, kind of strange, great big monster-sized silver rounds, kind of. And I'm going to take a deep dive into them and show them off to you. See what you think about these. Let me know what you think. If you're new to the channel, I like to begin my videos with a simple disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to offer you any kind of financial advice. I'm simply trying to share some of my experience having bought and sold precious metals and rare coins for the last 30 or 40 years. And I also like to begin my videos with a couple of concepts. I think these concepts are going to be kind of helpful, though they don't really work into the subject that we're talking about. You'll see that what I'm talking about here. So the first is, if these metals seem vaguely familiar, it's because I did talk about one of these way back in March of 2023. I know it's hard to believe that just over a year ago, this was my 10th video on YouTube. And I have since released about 100 videos on YouTube. I try to release a video every Friday night, so hopefully you are seeing this with me as it premieres on a Friday night, and mark your calendars. I try to get a video out every week on Fridays, so hopefully you'll join that with me. That video is called 999 Silver Coins for Advanced Collectors Volume 2 Larger Coins, and I'll put a link down below. If nothing else, there's a big cringe factor. Take a look at that video, and hopefully I have progressed a little bit as a YouTube creator in the last year and a couple of months. Let me know what you think about that too. So you have seen one of these before, but we've never taken a deeper dive into this entire group, and this is a matching set. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Another concept I wanted to touch on really briefly is it's not so much a concept that applies to this video, it's actually a concept that applies to YouTube. And if you didn't know it, YouTube provides a closed captioning service for people who are watching the videos. And I've noticed myself recently that I'm inclined to touch on the closed captioning if a video content creator's volume is not up as loud as maybe I want it to be. And I know I'm guilty of doing that myself sometimes too. Sometimes YouTubers' voices are at a sound level that seems to mimic the background noise. I've been accused of that many times in the past. I know a lot of people put on my videos to fall asleep to. I don't mind. I really don't. If this is what makes you fall asleep, helps you get to sleep, that's a good thing. I think that's a fantastic thing. But there is a little CC button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll show a picture so you can see what it is that I'm talking about. All you have to do is click on that, and YouTube will come up with closed captioning for every video that you watch. And if you want to turn it off, all you have to do is click on it again, and it disappears. So I'll show you what it looks like once you've actually clicked on it. You can see the words coming up that mimic quite well what it is that I'm saying. I don't have to do anything with that. That's an automatic feature. It's probably AI driven. But I think it's a really neat feature, especially if you do have a little bit of hearing loss or if you've got a background noise that keeps you from being able to hear this. Give it a shot, see what you think. It's amazing how easy you adapt to reading the words as they come across the chyron on the bottom of your screen. I think it's a neat thing. So that's the second kind of concept. And the last one I wanted to concept I wanted to present is the concept of metals. And of course, we've talked about metals many times on this channel. This is really kind of an interesting thing that came and went, and it seems like it flies under the radar now, so that most people don't even realize that this was a thing, and this was a big thing going back about 60 years ago. Metals made out of silver started to become popular in the 1940s, 1950s. I think they were an offshoot of the so-called dollar area of numismatics, and I will be having videos about so-called dollars coming out soon. I've touched on them a little bit in the past in my video about my 5 oldest pieces of bullion, I actually show a so-called dollar. That's just a metal that was about the size of a silver dollar. That's why they're called so-called dollars. A fascinating aspect of numismatics. If you have any interest taking a deeper dive into it, it's a very rewarding part of our hobby. But these metals became popular in the 1940s, 1950s. In 1961, they really took off, and I'm going to talk about exactly why that happened. But metals are not really the same thing as a round. You can have a round that is a very, very beautiful round, and you might say that it's metallic or that it is even a metal. But what really separates them is that metals, generally speaking, don't have a face value, right? They're not a coin. They usually don't say the weight on them. The intention wasn't that you were buying a silver bullion vehicle. It was a piece of art, so it doesn't usually say the weight on them. Sometimes they're made in sterling silver, sometimes they're made in 999 silver, as these examples that you see before you are. And the origin is often not given on them also, unless it's on the very edge, and we'll definitely take a look at that a little bit later. So these kind of, for the most part, predated what we would think of as rounds. Those are usually 1 troy ounce of 999 silver, one of the least expensive ways to buy silver. And these were maybe the grandparents or the great-great-grandparents of what we think of as rounds. So just wanted to kind of differentiate the two, between a metal and a round. I will be having videos coming out soon about the definitions that we use often. I know people are asking me for those, so I'm going to make a quick video where we talk about those definitions. But for right now, we're talking about metals. See if you can pick out how they are similar to rounds. See if you can notice what makes them different from rounds. How about that? So these metals that we're looking at here, these are called the engraver metals, or famous engraver metals. And these were made by a guy named Toivo Johnson. I know Toivo is kind of a strange name now, but it's actually a pretty popular name where he was from. His ancestry is Finnish, from Finland. And he was born in 1913. He was a numismatist from Maine. Again, his family from Finland. He was a well-known coin dealer in the 1930s and 1940s. He specialized in classic commemorative coins. Those were a field that exploded in the mid-1930s, mid to late 1930s, so about 1934, 1938, that 4-year stretch of time. If you've ever wondered, if you're looking at a red book, if you're a collector of classic commemoratives, you'll notice that there were a whole bunch that were released within a really short window there. It's really 1934, 1938. We released about 27 of them in that period of time, but when you include the different mint marks and the different years that some of these pieces came out, these commemorative half dollars, a lot of them were released over several years, 2 or 3 or 4 years, sometimes even longer than that. So if you're including all the different mint marks and all the different years that these pieces were released, there was a proliferation. There were a ton of these commemorative half dollars that came out in that short period of time, and that's really what Toivo Johnson specialized in. So that was his wheelhouse. That's what he did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the birth of these metals, what kind of brought them about, and then we're going to take a look at each one of these individually. And then I'll show some examples of what it is that makes each of these kind of interesting and special, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with my thoughts about these. And this is kind of cool. I would really like to get your opinion about these, because these don't come up for sale very often. You might not have ever even seen those if you didn't see that earlier video that I did where I touched on these. But let me know your thoughts. My thoughts kind of shift back and forth between thinking that these are really neat and thinking that these are just kind of weird and bizarre. So let me know what you think about them. The birth of these metals. So as a dealer, Toivo Johnson would have witnessed the explosion of 925 and ultimately 999 pure silver metals that began in the 1950s, but really took off in 1961. What happened in 1961 that really kind of was lightning in a bottle in a lot of ways when it comes to silver bullion metals, and we'll see this kind of lead to probably the birth of rounds. Like I said, these are kind of the grandparents or great-grandparents of rounds. Check me on that, see if you think about this. 1961, there was a John F. Kennedy inaugural medal that was released, and I'll show a picture of it here. This was designed by a gentleman named Paul Manship. And if Manship sounds familiar, and he may to some people, he was a leader of the Art Deco design movement, really 1930s, 1940s. And if you've ever been to Rockefeller Center or have seen pictures of Rockefeller Center in New York City, there's the great big golden statue fountain of Prometheus, and he's actually the one who designed that. I'll show some images here. A very popular backdrop for a ton of movies and TV shows. You have undoubtedly seen this in lots of movies. He's actually the guy that designed that sculpture. That's what he was most famous for. But he was contracted to make John F. Kennedy's inaugural medal in 1961. And, nobody really knew how well these were going to sell. And he designed them, and they were struck by a company called Medallic Arts. And we'll talk about Medallic Arts again a little bit later. The Kennedy medal, 2.75 inches in diameter, weighs about 5.5 troy ounces, 5.6 technically. So this was kind of an interesting medal, and we think probably based on a little bit of gentle nudging and pushing by Jackie Kennedy, the initial run of these pieces, which was 7,500 pieces, sold out very, very quickly, and it kind of started a little bit of a stampede for these types of medals. So a lot of the metal companies that were out there started producing a series of medals that were kind of based on either presidents or famous politicians or scientists, and they kind of caught the imagination of the general population for a brief period of time. And I think Toivo was watching this happen. Remember, he had been a numismatist, a dealer of commemoratives, so this was really in his wheelhouse. He understood the idea of a commemorative medal. Obviously at the time we didn't know where that was going to lead in 1961. But this proliferation of medals started, and I think Toivo Johnson wanted to jump on that bandwagon. He had an idea in his head for a while to create a series of medals that would celebrate famous engravers, and by that I mean really kind of the designers of some of the most famous coins in history. And as a quick aside, I think this is kind of interesting. I'm going to show a picture of the manship medal. This is the obverse and reverse. Does it remind you of anything? Have you seen a Kennedy medal that looks like that from anywhere else? I maintain that this was really a precursor of the 1964 Kennedy half dollar. And oddly, Manship doesn't get any kind of credit for having designed this. Now, you can make the case that it's significantly different in some ways from the Kennedy half dollar, but I think if you take a look at the writing around the edge, if you look at the orientation of Kennedy, the partial bust or the half bust facing left, if you're looking at the reverse in particular, I understand that that's probably just the seal of the President of the United States, but man, it sure looks like the 1964 Kennedy, and unfortunately Manship doesn't get any credit for that at all. It goes to Gilroy Roberts and Frank Gasparo, who were the kind of the two mint designers of the time. Interestingly, one of those would become a producer of medals himself shortly. So what led to Toivo? He was seeing the Manship medal selling out, and he conceived of this series that he thought would be a logical way to produce items that would be popular for a captive audience. So if you're making medals, he liked the idea of making medals that would celebrate famous coin designers. To him, it seemed like a layup, right? If you are a coin collector, not only would you want to collect coins and medals, but having them that celebrated famous coin designers, it seems really logical. It seems like a great idea, kind of, on paper at least. So that's kind of what he wanted to do. And if you do the quick math on the Manship medals, that Kennedy medal, the 1961 medal, 7,500 examples at 5.6 ounces apiece, that's 42,000 troy ounces of silver. Blew out the door when nobody realized that there was really a market for this kind of thing. So you can see those numbers and gears turning in Toivo's head. He probably thought he had a pretty good idea. And again, on paper, it does kind of seem like it's a great idea. So he wanted to reproduce the designs of famous designers, including Victor David Brenner, Morgan, Longacre, St. Gaudens, Barber. He knew he had to spread out a little bit. He couldn't just make it American designers, although maybe that would have helped him in the end. So if you're going to talk about creating these designs of these famous designers, the obvious thing to do is to reproduce the coins that they were most famous for. But I think that that's going to open up a can of worms for him, and we'll see that a little bit later. So We take for granted, let's just dive into it. We take for granted that there are modern rounds, and this is an example of a round you may have seen recently. I did a video about this. This is a design based on Christian Gobrecht's Flying Eagle or Gobrecht Dollar or Seated Liberty design. This is a really, really common theme for rounds. And you have undoubtedly seen rounds that celebrate Christian Gobrecht's rounds. There's also tons of rounds, 999 silver rounds, that have the Morgan dollar image on them. The James Earl Fraser's Buffalo nickel is an incredibly popular round right now. Lots of different companies are producing these in great numbers. But at the time, this was really not done. No one had ever really done this before. And I think that that's really the genesis of his failure, if it is a failure, with these rounds, these medals. And we'll talk about that in just a second too. No one had ever really done this before. Remember, this was 60 years ago. And the idea of playing with official mint releases, it seems a little bit shocking now to some people who aren't familiar with stacking, with our hobby. But imagine 60 years ago, this was something that was going to be problematic. He was going to have problems with it. So he thought of this series of famous designers, and he went to Medallic Art Company. That was, I believe, the company that had produced the JFK in 1961. And he asked them to help him produce this series of rounds. Apparently, they didn't like the idea, primarily for the idea that it was touching on American coin designs. Again, this is kind of a problematic thing. He was breaking ground, and I think that he probably had good intentions, but it had never really been done before, so people weren't really quite sure what to make of it. And I think that may come back to haunt him a little bit later. Apparently, his meeting with Medallic Art Company did not go well. They actually exchanged words, and he left in a huff. And he went to see Medallic Art's main competitor. That's a company called Metal Arts Company. And Metal Arts liked the idea maybe a little bit better than Medallic Arts, and they agreed to help him out, but they didn't want these metal designs to be exact. So that was their one thing. Now, when we think about it, we're looking at these designs. These are, the reason I called these monsters is look at this compared to a silver round. You get an idea of the scale that we're talking about. Nobody would have confused this if they had made exact designs. That is, believe it or not, a real Morgan dollar. Look how tiny it is. It looks like a dime or a quarter compared to one of these Toivo Johnson pieces. But Metal Arts was a little bit more receptive, and they eventually said yes to it. But they wanted to design these in a kind of a different way that hadn't really been done before with metals. They used something called a pantograph. And I don't know very much about the pantograph, other than it's almost kind of a tracing device. Typically, when you design a coin, you start with a great big slab of clay and you literally dig into it. You're making a sculpture almost, and it's a great big sculpture most of the time. We use something called a Janvier machine that reduces the size while maintaining the quality of those big things, and that's how designs are cut into the form that eventually becomes the die and strikes the coin. But they weren't doing this in this case. They were using a pantograph. And the pantograph is something that kind of traces a drawing. So somebody, Toivo or somebody at Metal Arts Company, made these drawings based on designs. And then the pantograph kind of cut a die for these pieces. And that may be part of the problem too. Again, these aren't supposed to be exact. Metal Arts didn't want them to be exact, and Toivo eventually agreed to make them with a pantograph that wouldn't be an exact duplication. It's still awfully close in a lot of cases, and again, I think that's going to come back to haunt him a little bit later. So the first ones that he released, and he released 6 pieces in this series. The first one was a Victor David Brenner, most famous for producing the Lincoln Cent, right? That's a VDB design. If you've ever heard of the 1909 SVDB, the VDB are his initials on the back, standing for Victor David Brenner. So that's the most obvious design that probably would have been made for a VDB. And then he made the Barber design, the Charles Barber design, famous for the Barber coinage of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then he went with a St. Gaudens design. Augustus St. Gaudens, obviously one of America's most well-known sculptors and coin designers. The $20 St. Gaudens named after him. How popular is that? So he released those in 1962, and then he followed with 3 more in 1963. So I'll go into these and I'll show you what it is that we're looking at. Again, it's hard to grasp the scale of these pieces. These things are massive. One of the nice things about the designer that was helping him with the pantograph is that these things take on a ridiculous level of relief. We talk about relief in terms of like the 1921 peace dollar, a high relief dollar. But the effect of these pieces is that these designs are really three-dimensional. Might be a little bit hard to see on your screen, but they really stick out really far. They are really, really cool in that respect, in that regard. So let's talk about the examples that we see here, the 6 pieces of his original series. And again, kind of take notes and let me know what you think about these. Some people think they're awful. Some people think they're really cool. I switch back and forth between thinking these are just bizarre to thinking these are really interesting pieces of numismatic history. And I believe because of the fact that they are 999 silver. These really represent one of the earliest ways that the average person would have ever seen and held pure 3/9 silver. Remember at this time, and this is 1961, 62, 63, our 90% circulating coinage was still out there and abundant. That's what you spent every single day. So the idea of having 999 silver was probably not something that you came across unless you were a scientist or a technician somewhere making high-end equipment. You just didn't see it very often. It certainly wasn't what you ate dinner with, and it wasn't what your wife was wearing around her neck in the form of a necklace. That's sterling silver. So this being 3/9 silver is somewhat unusual, a little bit different. The St. Gaudens. We'll start there. So, of course, right, if you're going to make a medal for Augusta St. Gaudens, you're going to make it based off of the $20 gold piece, right? No. And again, this is kind of a repeating theme, and this is kind of a strange thing also. What is this? This is Augusta St. Gaudens. This is a duplication of the 1892-1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That celebrated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus discovering America. So that was one of the most important World's Fairs that happened in the early 1900s in America, and these medals were given out to everybody who was an exhibitor there. It's actually a well-known design, once again, within the segment of numismatists, of numismatics, that deals with medals, and I actually do have a copy of it here. I'll see if I can show both of them at the same time. I'm not sure that I can. We'll give it a try. So this is an actual bronze medal given at the 1892-1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And this is the Augusta St. Gaudens medal created by Toivo Johnson. They are a pretty good likeness, aren't they? I think he did a pretty good job considering. Now, these weren't a denominated coin. There's no chance that these pieces were going to spark the interest of the Secret Service, right? Nobody had ever spent one of these. It wasn't designed to be spent. But that's what he chose to make the medal on, rather than the $20 gold piece or even the popular $10 gold piece that was St. Gaudens' design also, the $10 Indian. So what's the back of it? You notice the metal orientation there. There is at least a small representation of the $20 gold piece. I'll bring it in a little bit. You can see a little bit of toning here. That's not a bad representation, but no one would ever really have confused this with an actual $20 gold piece, right? It just doesn't make sense. And yet this was one of Toivo Johnson's problems with these pieces. This building that you see here is called Aspet, and that is St. Gaudens' studio and home. And I believe it was in Cornish, New Hampshire. Yeah, that's where it was. It still is. It's actually a national park now. Some of you probably have visited and you've been able to see elements of St. Gaudens' design work there. So that was really one of the first ones that he released. Not a bad design. If you like the design, it's not a bad likeness. I think it captures the idea. It's a little bit left wanting from the original design, but Augusta St. Gaudens was one of the finest sculptors of all time in a lot of people's opinion. So it's not surprising maybe that he didn't get this exactly right. And again, look how big this thing is. And I'll show a close-up of the edge mark of all of these pieces a little bit later. See if I can actually bring this into focus. What we're looking for here is we're looking for the name of the company. Of course, it's hard to bring it into focus. You've got Mako there. You've got the name of the company that made these, and it actually says 999 silver on it. I'll see if I can bring it in a little bit closer for some of the other issues that we take a look at. And they're all edge marked 140, 140, 148, I believe. That is the number. So this is a matching set, and it's one of the earliest matching sets that we know of. I'll talk again about that a little bit later. Victor David Brenner is the next one that we're going to talk about. Obverse. So obviously, if you're going to make a coin that is dedicated, a medal that's dedicated to Victor David Brenner, you're going to put the Lincoln cent on it, right? No, apparently not. Again, this is kind of a weird thing that Toivo Johnson was doing. A beautiful medal. You may never have seen this one before. In fact, I'm not sure that I've actually ever seen the exact medal from which this came. This is a medal that commemorates the 1902 visit to the United States by Prince Henry of Prussia. That's Mercury there in a cloud of roses and fruit. And that was designed to represent commerce. This staff here you probably have seen many times before. This staff with the snakes on it, right? Does that look familiar? That's called a caduceus, which is intertwined snakes around Mercury's staff. And it was originally kind of an idea of something that spurred commerce. This was something that helped people to buy and sell and trade. And that's why this was part of the medal. Now, when we see something like that, we think of medicine, right? This is kind of a symbol of doctors or hospitals. But that's not part of this original medal. 1902 is when this medal was released. I'll show examples so you can see what it is that we're talking about here. And I also want to plug medallicartcollector.com. This is a website that I've used many, many times before. I did a series of videos about the 1901 Pan American medals, if you haven't seen it, and nobody has. It's not a very popular video series. It is something that's near and dear to my heart. That's why I made it. I'll put a link to those down below if you want to take a deeper dive into those medals. But the medallicartcollector.com is a fantastic resource, and that's where this image comes from. So Victor David Brenner, of course, it's going to have a picture of his home on the back or a big picture of him on the back. Not so much. So we've got Victor David Brenner here and Lincoln here. What is this structure? This is Lincoln's boyhood home. His log cabin. At least it's supposed to be his log cabin. Now, we know now that that's not really the case. We've done core samples on it, and we know that it dates to probably the time that Lincoln was actually already president of the United States. But this is kind of historically what people think of as Lincoln's cabin. Kind of a weird thing to put on the back, right? I think he's kind of missing the mark on all of these so far. What do you think? Do you agree? Interesting. The next one, Barber. Let's take a look at that one. And this one, if you're going to do a medal dedicated to Charles Barber, you're going to put Barber coinage on the front, right? No, apparently not again. So this is kind of peculiar. Now, I do think that this is one of the most handsome medals of this series, and I think it's really cool. You can just barely make out this little line going to his monocle on the other side there. It's just a really spare, interesting, beautiful design. This is the 1905 Theodore Roosevelt U.S. Mint Presidential Medal, and that's what this is based off of. I'll show a picture of that too. It's actually very close. It's very, very similar. So that's Barber's design. And on the reverse of it, well, there's a little bit better. So there is the Barber design that we're all familiar with. That's the Colombian $50 design and the Isabella quarter design. What is this design here? This is actually the 1915 Panama Pacific 50-cent commemorative. Again, this is a classic commemorative $50. And that's why I believe that Toivo Johnson would have wanted this device on it. It was designed by Charles Barber. It is a beautiful design, but I think it's kind of almost a silent nod to the fact that Toivo Johnson was a dealer in commemorative $50, especially these classic pieces from this early period of time. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. What do you think about that representation of that Barber design? Not the greatest, right? I mean, they're peculiar. Sure, they're very strange. So that's the three original ones that were released in, I believe, 1961, 1962. And then he decided to release three more. And this is where he kind of goes off on a little bit of a tangent, as if the rest of these aren't really tangential. But this is the first one that he released. If you've never seen this design before, this is actually probably the best image that he was able to capture on a coin. And that's because he didn't have to be precisely wrong. He didn't have to get it just a little bit off so that he wasn't going to confuse the Secret Service or anybody like that. This is the design by a classical ancient Greek designer called Eunaedos. And he designed for Dionysius the First something called a quadriga. That is quad, the root word there. That means four, right? The four horses you see here. A quadriga is a chariot being pulled by four horses. And he designed this one back in 400 AD, somewhere in that period of time. And it's considered by collectors of classic coins and engravers to be one of the most beautiful coins that was ever designed, especially in the ancient period. So this design is probably supposed to represent a decadram. A decadram is an enormous silver coin that was made in antiquity that was so big that it was really almost supposed to probably be a commemorative itself. So not inappropriate that he would have designed a commemorative, celebrating a commemorative by the designer of that commemorative. And if you're going to branch out from American designers, I think he made an interesting choice with this one to celebrate the ancient coin collecting world. But what else do you put on the back of it? You put something that kind of looks like the Parthenon, I guess, some kind of a Greek temple. And this is the obverse of that quadriga coin that we just looked at, the decadram. So there is a nod to that as well. But this is considered probably the most beautiful of the pieces from that 6-coin series. I'd have to agree. I think that that really is pretty. And again, you can just get the idea of how three-dimensional this piece is. It really does capture that three-dimensionality. Maybe even better than the original coin did. I'll show a picture of these. Now, the original coin is quite scarce, quite rare. These are one of the most prized collectibles from ancient coinage. And an example showed, that I'll show right here, sold at Stack's Bowers in January of 2022 for about $200,000. So just to give you an idea of how valuable these things are. Interestingly, the decadram is deca, 10, means 10 drams. And that means that this is a big, big silver coin, about 45 grams. So right about an ounce and a half. That's how big the classic pieces were. So not an inappropriate design. And this one I think is actually quite beautiful. Moving right along, Christian Gobrecht. Christian Gobrecht was the designer of the seated coins. And we'll take a look at the back here just so you get an idea of what we're talking about. But this design in particular, it's supposed to be I always see it as the flying eagle cent, and I know purists probably hate me for that. This is actually the Gobrecht dollar. That was the first dollar produced after the bus dollars of 1804, 1836 to 1839, but like the bus dollars, these were restruck, we think, all the way up until the 1870s. A beautiful coin, full of a lot of history, considered by many to be the best rendition of an American eagle on American coinage, and even Toivo Johnson's somewhat cumbersome designs actually came out pretty well in this piece. I think that's a pretty attractive version of it. These are expensive too. There is an example on eBay right now of one of these Gobrecht dollars in the $200,000 range, but you can find them cheaper than that. Interestingly, they only made a couple thousand of these, and again, they were dated to the 1830s, but struck all the way up until about the 1870s. And all of these were struck in proof, the original coins. That is the only series in the entire American coinage panoply that was ever all struck in proof, even though they were designed to be spent. So they have an interesting history like that too. And he talks about here about how Christian Gobrecht, in designing the most beautiful American eagle on American coins, probably didn't realize it, but you can see the little atoms everywhere on this piece, that he was designing a piece that would show America's supremacy in space. Remember, this is early 1960s Cold War period, before we got the man on the moon, but clearly in that Sputnik era when we were trying to outrace the Russians. And he, Toivo Johnson, decided that that was a great symbol to represent our race in space, and that we were ultimately going to win it. Again, a little bit weird, but kind of attractive. And that leads us to the final one, and that's the Longacre Morgan design. This one I've struggled with, and this is, if you're talking about something that I love and that I hate at the same time, you either love it or you hate it, right? So there's obviously the Morgan dollar, and this is the Indian cent that was Longacre's design. And this is a design that he would use repeatedly, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this was the Morgan silver dollar along with Longacre's Indian cent. Longacre was one of the most famous American designers. He designed a whole bunch of coins. Pretty much any coin that you used in the middle 1800s was a Longacre design. And the reverse, what else do you put on it? You put on the first mint of the United States. That's what this building represents. So again, I think Toivo Johnson tried to capture what these people meant to him, but I'm not sure that he was firing on all cylinders when it really came to it. I'm not sure that he really did a good job of capturing these. The pieces are beautiful in and of themselves. I think that there is definitely some artistic integrity to a lot of them, but they just kind of leave you wanting a little bit. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Some final thoughts. Again, we're talking about these pieces being massive, and I talked about them being monsters. That's true. These are all struck in 999 silver. There's that 140 mark, so you can see that this is a matching set. Every single one of these is actually numbered 140 on the edge. And we'll see if we can bring this in and get the details about it. One of these is really coolly duplicated. So it says, the Metal Arts Company, Rochester, New York, right? 999 silver. Again, that's what makes these really kind of interesting. This was one of the first opportunities for the average American to own 999 silver. These things are massive. They weigh between 6.8 and 7.4 troy ounces each. That's how big these are. And again, you're looking at that compared to a Morgan dollar. We'll take a look at the Morgan dollar versus Morgan's design just so you can get an idea of how big these things are. These are huge. They are interesting. You can find these individually. You don't see the sets come up for auction very often. I actually bought these in 2011, and I paid, at the time, right over melt for them, just a little bit over their melt value. So what are they worth now? It's difficult to say. You can find individual examples on eBay in the $375, $400 range. So if you're multiplying 400 times 6, maybe 2,000, give or take a little bit for that. So there's definitely a premium on these. That's probably $40 an ounce per ounce based on these being 999 silver. You can find the sets very, very rarely. You can find the individual pieces with some frequency, so you can try to collect a set if you wanted to. And it sounds like, I believe that the St. Gaudens and the VDB are the most scarce pieces of the set. The mintages on these are quite small. If the documentation that we have on them, and again, it's a little bit spotty because these were 60 years ago now. The Eunados, that's the ancient Greek one, about 1,000 of those made. The Gobrecht, about 1,000 of those. The St. Gaudens piece, 2,000 of those. The Barber piece, 1,200. The Longacre Morgan, 1,000, and the VDB, I guess I got those reversed. The Victor David Brenner, 2,000 pieces. So none of them more than 2,000 pieces, and some of them as few as 1,000 pieces. But they were not very popular. The truth is that the metals did not sell very well, and we don't know if it was a combination of a lot of different things. That's kind of what I suspect. You have these metals that kind of answer a question that had never been asked, right? These were a collection of metals that celebrated the designers at a point in time, the 1960s, when you probably could have found really nice examples made by all of these designers, not too expensively. Coins in the early 1960s weren't outrageously expensive, so if you wanted to collect Barber coinage, you could collect Barber coinage. If you wanted VDB pieces, if you want St. Gaudens pieces, they weren't that expensive in the first place. So why would you have a metal made out of them, even if it's 999 silver? So they weren't really a bullion vehicle. Remember, in this period of time, you were still spending 90%. If you wanted silver, you could get 90% by going down to your local bank and cashing in a few bills. So they weren't really bullion, and they weren't really coins. There wasn't a whole lot of collector interest in them, and I think Toivo Johnson thought he had a great idea when push came to shove. It just turned out that people didn't want something that was a close approximation of some of the designs that some of these designers had done. It just didn't sell very well. He went on to release a few other metals in the 1970s, and I think he saw the writing on the wall, and we'll touch on that again in just a moment. But in the 1970s, he realized that we're getting closer and closer to the centennial, and that's when a lot of these pieces really took off. And he released a Freedom medal that looked a lot like this on the obverse and a lot like the Gobrecht medal on the reverse, and we'll talk about that. I'll actually show an example of that here. He released those in the early 1970s, I think gearing up for the bicentennial, and he released them in copper and bronze and nickel, I believe, and you can still find those sets pretty easily on eBay. They run $30, $40, $50 for the sets. So what happened? Why did these not work? An article by a numismatist named Dick Johnson, he was a former coin and metal dealer himself, no relationship to Toivo Johnson, said that he'd been contacted by Toivo Johnson's son after Toivo's death, and I believe he died in 1973. He was contacted after his death, and the son, the heir of Toivo Johnson's estate, said that he still had multiple collections of these that were still available. 25 years after they'd been released, they still hadn't been able to sell them. And I was doing some calculations, and I'm thinking 25 years afterwards, that would have been well after that silver run-up that happened in the early 1980s, when they could have offloaded these. Remember, these were made in the early 1960s, when silver was quite inexpensive. They could have offloaded these at $35, $40, maybe even $50 an ounce for the silver that was contained in them. And his son just didn't feel like that was something he can do, and consequently he was still stuck with these. That dealer that I mentioned, Dick Johnson, actually declined buying them. That's how much he didn't want these either. It just happens sometimes, right? So why didn't they sell? I think they were solution in search of a problem. They weren't really coins. They weren't really bullion. Are they ugly? I go back and forth. I waffle back and forth. You know, the obverses here that you see here before you, I think a lot of them are quite attractive, especially like the Teddy Roosevelt piece, the classic piece. I think that's really beautiful. I do think that the Morgan and Longacre piece kind of misses the mark so much that it's, I don't want to say it's comical, but it just doesn't look right. Especially in our hobby, we hyper-focus on detail. And that just is not the Morgan dollar, and that is just not the Indian cent. But the reverse of these pieces tends to be a little bit cumbersome also. He just fills it with lots of words and trees and stuff like that, that we don't really see that happen very often on coinage. And it's not unattractive, but there's something that's a little bit kind of strange about it. Look at all of those devices squeezed in at once. It almost seems busy and overcalculated. What do I like about them? I think that Toivo Johnson was ahead of the curve. I think he understood that 90% was going to be coming to an end. I don't know how far back we knew that as coin collectors, as the general public knew that the 90% was going to be removed from our coinage by 1964, through 1964. But I think Toivo understood better than some people that because these pieces were not going to circulate, and we've talked about that a little bit before in regards to the Mexican Libertad, they weren't going to circulate, so they could be 999 silver. He didn't make these out of 90%. He didn't make them out of sterling silver. He made them out of 999 silver, and I think that that makes them really kind of special. I think he was a few moments ahead of his time. He just didn't even realize that. And as a silver vehicle, they couldn't have been that popular because that 90% was still circulating at the time. Even if you weren't able to pick up 90% of these came out in 1963, 1964. And I maintain that if you were looking for silver, you knew what you were doing back then. You certainly could have done that. You could have turned in silver certificates all the way up until 1968. But if you wanted 40% silver, it was there for the taking. So maybe that was one of the things that led to it also. Ultimately, I think it's interesting that the Secret Service had a sit down with Toivo Johnson and apparently told him in no uncertain terms that they did not like what he was doing. And I think that that probably took a lot of wind out of his sails. I think that might be one of the reasons why he went with the later series that he did that look nothing like the actual coins themselves. If you got a visit from the Secret Service, you might feel the same way. And in some ways, it's not really fair, right? Like I said, the designs that we see on a lot of silver rounds are quite common now to see the Morgan dollar design, the flying eagle design of the Indian cent, or the Gobrecht dollar, the seeded dollar, the peace dollar, the buffalo nickel, the mercury dime, the walking liberty half dollar. All of these are duplicated on rounds all the time now. But I think Toivo was just a little bit ahead of the time, and nobody really knew what to do with these pieces. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know ultimately what you think about these pieces. Does the fact that they are massive, chunky pieces of silver, these are massive 6.5, 7 troy ounce pieces of 999 silver, would you want these in your collection? Do they answer a question that you have now? Is this an interesting way to combine the idea of bullion and collectible metals? Does this appeal to you from a collecting standpoint? Does it appeal to you from a bullion standpoint? Like I said, I waffle back and forth, and it's one of those sets that sits in the safe, and I don't think about it too often. But every once in a while, I'll pull one out and think, yeah, these are actually pretty cool. These are really neat. I'm glad that I have these. This, 45, 50 troy ounces of 999 silver that I bought way back in the day, didn't pay very much for, and now I'm kind of glad I have them. As we lose more and more of these copies through attrition, they're probably just going to go up in value, so why not? If you have any questions about the individual metals, by all means, leave a question down below. As you know, I'm fond of saying, if you have a question, there's a good chance that somebody else has that question too. If you have suggestions or questions about another series or another video that you'd like to see me make, by all means, leave that question or that suggestion down below. I'd love to take a look at it. Maybe we can produce a series of videos, and of course, I will give you a big shout out if we do that. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, go ahead and click on subscribe. Share this with everybody that you can think of that is interested in that. I'd love to see the channel grow with more and more subscribers. We understand that there are only about half the people that watch the videos are actually subscribers. So if you've watched a couple, 3 of my videos and you haven't yet subscribed, it doesn't cost anything. Just click on that subscription button. I would love to have you be part of this community. I would really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as we go deeper into the world of coins and physical precious metals.